IoT is short for Internet of Things, and an IoT device is simply anything embedded with the ability to connect to a network for data exchange. These days, that can include all kinds of common devices like thermostats, security systems and cameras, and even appliances. In this module, we'll talk about this emerging threat, including tools and methodologies for IoT hacking, as well as countermeasures. IoT is short for Internet of Things. These things are actually physical objects connecting to a network in order to exchange data with other devices. This is quickly becoming one of the fastest growing technologies in the modern world. We see this in a wide range of things like smartwatches, televisions, and home security systems, and the range of devices continues to grow into everyday items that we previously never even considered giving connectivity to, like kitchen appliances, cars, front door locks, and much more. There are many plus sides to this, including the ability to more quickly and efficiently share data or perform actions. In fact, studies show that 67% of enterprises currently use IoT devices in some way. And that number is even larger within industrial manufacturing or healthcare environments. Studies show that these two separate sectors actually have a 90% deployment rate for IoT devices. As we've mentioned earlier in this course, the unfortunate fact is that often these devices were not built and designed with security in mind from their inception. So there are some risks to be aware of. Let's look at the typical data flow for an IoT device as an example of how these work. Let's take a typical home security system, such as a doorbell camera component. This system is connected to a gateway that allows for connectivity to the internet. That could be a wired or wireless gateway, and in a home setting, that could be something as simple as an ISP router or a wireless access point. Depending on the security system itself and how that is designed, they may send data out to an external server that is reachable over the internet. Let's say that our camera footage is stored on servers owned by the security company. As end users, we may commonly access the device ourselves, maybe using a mobile application or a mobile web browser that's also connected to the internet. We would authenticate with the company servers over the internet, and once authenticated, we could perform actions such as remote management of our device, or even accessing any stored data from the device contained on the data server. This also allows us to view data in real time from the doorbell camera. This type of IoT data flow could take on various forms depending on whether we're storing our data in the cloud like we see here, or whether we're using a home storage device on our own. But this is just one common example of how that works. So let's first outline some common risks with IoT devices. Of course, we've already mentioned the lack of security, and that also includes the lack of privacy as well. Many of these devices lack even the basic security mechanisms that we would expect in a device connected to the internet. Because they often have low processing power, they will also commonly lack protection mechanisms like the encryption of data, and that means that data could potentially be passing in plain text. Additionally, many use well-known port schemes which open up the device to attacks from the public internet. Because these devices interact with a web application interface, they are also vulnerable. We've looked at some of the dangers of improperly secured web applications and web servers already, and many of these devices even contain an embedded web server technology that might be attacked. And the challenges of updating the firmware and operating system should also be mentioned here as well. It's often more difficult to perform an update for the average user who may not be as tech savvy, and for that reason, these updates may get overlooked. As for specific threat vectors, we can go back to OWASP as the authority on this. They have a top 10 Internet of Things threat list, so let's discuss these. First, we have weak, guessable, or hard-coded passwords. The use of easily brute force or publicly available credentials is a giant threat to this, and even unchangeable credentials. Some of those are in place on certain IoT devices. This also includes backdoors into firmware or client software that grants unauthorized access to deployed systems. Next, we have insecure network services. In some cases, we'll have unneeded or insecure network services running on the device itself, and these are especially dangerous when they're exposed to the internet. This can compromise our confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information, or even allow for unauthorized remote control. Next is insecure ecosystem interfaces. We've talked about the web application interface, but this also includes the back end or the cloud or even the mobile interfaces. Anything in the ecosystem outside of the device itself that is related to the way that it connects. Common issues include the lack of proper authentication and authorization, having weak or no encryption in place, and of course the lack of input filtering as we've seen with SQL injection attacks. Next, we have no secure update mechanism. Because the processing capabilities and the software of many of these devices is so basic, oftentimes they lack the ability to confirm the validity of firmware or operating system updates. This introduces an issue where maybe compromised firmware could be uploaded to the device, which would give an attacker access. Next, we have insecure or outdated components. We've talked about the large number of devices that are now being attached to the Internet of Things, and oftentimes this is done quickly to try to meet market demand. And sometimes that's done with third-party software or open source software, or even third-party hardware components that may be compromised or that may be at risk. So these components would include both the hardware and the software. Next, we have insufficient privacy protection. Users' personal information that's being stored on the device or maybe in the ecosystem, even in a cloud server, that is often used insecurely and without permission. A lot of times this information is shared even without the end user's knowledge. This could be outlined in the end user licensing agreements, but many times those don't get read and users aren't aware of how their data is being shared. Next, we have the insecure handling of data. This would include data that is at rest, in other words, data that is being stored locally or stored on a server, and data that's in motion, data that's being processed and sent back and forth. We've already mentioned that these devices are often basic and lack the ability to encrypt and decrypt data, meaning that sometimes this data can get passed in plain text, which is susceptible to being intercepted and read. Next is lack of device management. Because many of these devices are being deployed and used by a typical end user, an average home user, let's say, often they will lack advanced device management features that we may look at as security professionals. Now, that's done out of a need to try and make these simple for the average end user, but that is a risk because we can't properly go in there and secure it maybe as we want to. Next, we have insecure default settings. Many times devices are shipped with insecure default settings, which could be things like unnecessary ports being open, or maybe default passwords in place. And unfortunately, many times these are left in place. These IoT devices are designed to get up and going quickly and easily for the end user, so they may get them on their network very quickly and never even think about the default settings that might be in place. It's also possible that there are restrictions in place that keep us from modifying certain insecure configurations. The lack of physical hardening is the last one that we'll mention, and that is rated as the number one threat. This allows the potential for attackers to gain sensitive information that could help in a future remote attack or even take control of the device itself. Many of these devices are out in the open. If we think about maybe a smart doorbell, it's just hanging out in the open on your door, and that can be easily stolen or physically manipulated in some way to gain access. We've been talking about IoT devices from the perspective of maybe the typical home user primarily so far, but I also want to point out a few places in the enterprise that is considered to be IoT, things you may have not considered, which present a potential attack surface. Some of these include obvious things like cameras and security systems, but that could also be things like retail kiosks, humidity and temperature sensors that are commonly found in server rooms, remote health monitoring devices found in the healthcare industry. Those gather and share patient data within the local network, and even industrial IoT sensors used in places like production lines. Those are used to track and optimize manufacturing. These are just a few common examples to underscore the fact that IoT devices typically make us immediately think of home consumer products, but these are certainly prevalent in our enterprise networks as well. So let's outline a common methodology for hacking IoT devices, as we have with many other specific areas. Many of these steps are going to look familiar and they're going to seem very similar to other methodologies that we've looked at, including the first step of information gathering. If we have local access to the network in some way, then we can certainly use many of our traditional means for gathering information, such as in-map scanning or Wireshark. And we, of course, want to try and discover the same types of information as we would with any information gathering project, like IP addresses, host names, device manufacturers, operating system versions, open ports and protocols, and so on. In regard to the protocols themselves, there are a few that you want to be aware of that specifically relate to IoT devices. So let's talk about those. We have two broad categories that we can separate these into, which are data protocols and network protocols. So first, with data protocols, these are used in low power devices where those devices communicate with hardware on the user side without using an internet connection. This is typically achieved through a dedicated physical connection between the device and the user interface. These data protocols would be of less interest to us since it would require some sort of physical tampering in order to gain access. The category that is of more interest in regard to our hacking methodology is network protocols. This is a vector that could allow communication with a device without us having direct access to that or without having to physically interact with the device. Wi-Fi, of course, is the one that immediately comes to mind. That's commonly used for IoT devices. Other standards include Bluetooth, which is also well known. This, of course, has a much shorter range, meaning that we would have to be in a closer physical proximity in order to take advantage of this. We also have the Zigbee protocol. Although this isn't new, it's been around for more than a decade, in fact. It is an alternative used in place of Wi-Fi or Bluetooth for some low-powered IoT devices. In fact, many smart light bulbs use the Zigbee protocol as opposed to the point-to-point connectivity of Bluetooth. And that's because Zigbee operates in a mesh network that allows it to communicate with multiple devices and to scale very easily. There's also Z-Wave, another wireless protocol that's been around for quite some time. This is also a low-power alternative to Wi-Fi, and it has a much larger range than Bluetooth. Z-Wave operates in a different wireless frequency as opposed to the previously mentioned Zigbee. So where Zigbee has to deal with potential congestion on the 2.4 gigahertz band, Z-Wave operates in the less crowded 800 to 900 megahertz range. For that reason, Z-Wave is considered to be more reliable in general, and we do see that a bit more. We also have something called LoRa or LoRaWAN, LoRa being short for long range. This uses different frequencies depending on your geolocation. So for example, in North America, this uses 915 megahertz, but that differs elsewhere, such as the 868 megahertz used in Europe. This is another low power consumption standard, but it has a much longer range over the lower frequency bands. So these are all protocols that you would be interested in knowing about in regard to what is in use on an IoT device during your information gathering. This can lead you to discovering potential entry points. The next step, once we have performed our information gathering, is to perform vulnerability scanning, something that we've looked at before. We would want to use tools that we've looked at previously, like Nmap or NIC2, to identify IoT connected devices and the ports and services that they are running. We also might want to use Wireshark to perform packet sniffing against the network in order to discover vulnerable ports and services. We might specifically use that using a wireless feature. We might want to capture wireless traffic and inspect that for wireless IoT devices. As we've said, our typical tools apply here, but there are also specific tools for IoT device discovery. One of those I'll mention is the Shodan search engine. You can see that here on the screen, and that is specifically for discovering IoT devices. If you have any publicly exposed service in any way, then you will be indexed by the Shodan search engine. That's a simple fact. If you take a look at our pricing page here, you'll see that we do have a paid feature here, but there are ways to use this for free in a limited manner. It's fairly reasonably priced. If you're a freelancer and you're performing a lot of assessments, it's a great tool for information gathering. But as I've said, you can use this for free in a very limited manner, and you can get very specific search results. You can search by GPS coordinates, by city, by country, and so on. If you're using a paid version, you can actually integrate this into something like Parrot OS, and use that from your terminal. So just as a very general example, let's go into the search bar here and let's pop in webcam and let's perform a search. So you can see all of the information that was gathered, including some banners and other information. If we actually click on one of these links, it will open the external link and let us view this. So for example, this one here from the United States, if we open that up, we can actually take a look at these live webcams streaming. And this would be for anywhere, again, that is opened up to the public internet. Any publicly exposed service that you have available is going to be indexed by Shodan. And you can search very specifically by geolocation and other things. We can also do something like, let's search for APC. APC is a well-known manufacturer for things like battery backup systems or temperature sensors, and these are used many times in enterprise networks. So we see one listed here, and it looks like that's a logon. So if we click this external link and launch this, you'll see that we're actually brought to a login page for some sort of APC device, whether that's a battery backup system or a temperature sensor. We don't know at the moment. But again, you can see the kind of access this gives by indexing these publicly available web services. And there are other similar sites out there as well that are similar to Shodan that you can find, which will perform similar searches. The next phase, once we've gathered information, once we've discovered a vulnerability, whether that's an open port or otherwise, would be to launch an attack. As with all of our attack methodologies, the tactics and tools used here are going to depend on the vulnerabilities that you've discovered. So for example, with a logon screen that we discovered, we might use some sort of password attack to get into that. We might use some sort of enumeration tactics and so on. So there are protocol-specific tools based on the IoT device as well, such as tools dedicated for exploiting the Zigbee or Z-Wave protocols. And there are even hardware-based tools that allow us to capture or perform denial of service attacks against wireless communication protocols like RF or LoRa. The next phase is gaining remote access. Based on the vulnerability we've exploited, we may be able to turn the device into a backdoor into the network without the need to interact with any other end user device. And the advantage here is that these IoT devices are typically going to be excluded from firewall or IPS detection, and because they are simplistic and low powered, they certainly won't be running any antivirus or anti-malware software on the device itself. A common method for this is through Telnet. Telnet is a well-known protocol for providing command line access to a device in order to configure the device. And many IoT devices will have Telnet capabilities built in and enabled by default. If we discover an available Telnet port, this is one of the most common ways to obtain remote access and also to begin pivoting in the network. We can learn information about any other devices that may be connected to the IoT device, along with their specific hardware, software, and firmware versions, which would allow us to continue with our initial phases of information gathering and vulnerability scanning. And finally, the last phase is to maintain access. Methods for this would include embedding backdoor access if possible, or opening ports for communication. We would want to maybe clear any logs to hide our tracks, and a more complex method is altering the device's firmware. There are many examples online of firmware extraction tools where you can extract the existing firmware on a device. Alternatively, if you have access to see the firmware version, then you could just simply go to the manufacturer's website and download that firmware. Firmware can be altered with any hex editor, but be warned that this is extremely complex and it's involved. There's a high likelihood that if you try to modify the firmware in some way and you upload that to a device, it could completely brick the device, which sometimes is the overall goal of an attacker. If that's your goal, then that's fairly easy to do with firmware modification. If you have enough skill, a modified firmware can be used to allow for maintained access if successfully modified and applied to an IoT device. For completion, let's talk about a few more IoT-specific hacking tools. In addition to more general tools like Metasploit, which we've already looked at in this course, I want to briefly point out some tools specifically made for IoT hacking. And in turn, these are also made for mitigating IoT risks on an enterprise network. We can use these to perform vulnerability assessments against an enterprise network to try and close up any holes or vulnerabilities that we may find. The first one I'll mention is the Internet of Things scanner from BullGuard. This will allow you to check your local network for any internet-connected devices that may be exposed in regard to public services. And you'll also see that this also has the ability to check whether or not you've been indexed by the Shodan search engine, which we've looked at. If you discover that you are on there, then you definitely want to take that into consideration and start closing down those security holes. You don't want to have those publicly exposed services available over the internet for anyone to try and take advantage of. The next one I'll point to is a GitHub repository for a tool called FirmWalker. This is a bash script that's used for searching the extracted or mounted firmware of a file system. So this is a firmware tool that can look for things like usernames and passwords that may be stored on a device. It can look for email addresses as well. It can look for common binaries such as SSH. And it will look for common web servers that are known to be used on IoT devices. So this is a method for actually walking through the firmware to try to look for any vulnerabilities. Next, we have a tool called Fiddler. This tool allows us to track and manipulate HTTP requests in a similar manner to Burp Suite that we've looked at already. In the Fiddler settings, there's a connections tab that will let us set this as a proxy. And that means that all of our HTTP traffic would be proxied through Fiddler, again, just as we looked at with Burp Suite. We can use this to ensure that anything that we're doing, any traffic that's being passed between our server and an IoT device is not being passed maybe in clear text. This was an issue discovered with Nest Thermostat recently. We also have a tool called Killer Bee. Here you can see the GitHub repository for that. This is a tool for testing and auditing the Zigbee protocol, which we've mentioned is a popular protocol for communication between IoT devices. And the last one I'll point to is called Firmalizer. Most IoT devices are running some sort of Linux distribution, so that's what this is focused on. This enables us to scan against a device to try and discover any vulnerable files, any known vulnerabilities that are listed there, and it will present some really nice output graphics in regard to our overall risk analysis. So just a few tools to mention to wrap things up. This is certainly not comprehensive. There are many tools out there specifically for IoT. And again, you would include your typical tools, your general tools that we've looked at already as well. Things like Nmap, Metasploit, Nick2, and more. Let's look at some IoT hacking countermeasures now. These are important considerations and recommendations for any enterprise network that is employing IoT devices. If we're implementing a new IoT device into our existing network, this would begin with choosing an IoT vendor that is trusted in regard to their device security. We've mentioned already that many of these devices are not initially designed with security in mind. So we should do some due diligence and perform some research to determine the vendor's security policies during design and development, and also how they maintain their ongoing security compliance. Many of the security feeds that we've looked at earlier in this course is a good place to search out specific IoT devices and vendors to take a look at any known vulnerabilities. And those would include things like the CVE database that we've looked at. This can also help you determine how quickly and efficiently the vendor addresses new vulnerabilities. As for the device itself, we should disable any default user accounts on a device. As we've mentioned, all of these devices will come with a default account in place with administrator access, especially off-the-shelf solutions and consumer products. That's necessary for us to be able to log in and configure those devices. So it's important to disable these types of accounts once the device is configured and ready for deployment. Recent research shows that up to 20% of IoT devices still have default login credentials in place, and those are common username and password combinations that can be easily found online in product documentation, things like admin or user. Depending on the IoT device, This can include access over the command line through SSH or Telnet, FTP access, and the management GUI that's reachable from a browser. Of course, we also want to ensure that we're using our strong password policies here, which obviously should be implemented throughout our network and certainly with IoT devices. Speaking of management, insecure protocols like Telnet open us up to significant security holes in our IoT devices. We've mentioned previously that despite its known weaknesses, Telnet is still very prevalent for IoT devices, and that's often enabled by default over port 23. Telnet has no built-in security mechanisms, so it sends all communications in plain text, which can be easily intercepted and interpreted. We should disable Telnet on any IoT device, and if we prefer management over the command line interface, we should opt for secure management protocols, such as using SSH over port 22 instead. SSH uses an encrypted format to send data, along with public key authentication through asymmetric encryption. An example of a classic Telnet attack was the Mirai botnet, which scanned the internet for remote Telnet connections that were using factory-assigned default credentials. That access was used to infect IoT devices after gaining access and turn those devices into a botnet. This botnet famously took down some high-profile sites like Reddit and Netflix in a series of targeted DDoS attacks. Another protection mechanism to consider is a virtual private network architecture. This can make our IoT device networks significantly more secure because all of the traffic going to and from an IoT device would be traveling through an encrypted tunnel. Now, if you've used VPN clients before, you know that many of these can be easily implemented if we're using a desktop or a laptop or even a mobile phone. There are dedicated clients and applications that will do this. But as we've said, many IoT devices are very low powered, and they don't have the processing capabilities to do this. They don't have native VPN capabilities or the ability to even install a VPN client software. For this reason, we may have to think about employing the VPN as a more broad network solution, maybe at the firewall or router level. This can provide the benefits of shielding our IP addressing scheme and also making sure that we're not vulnerable to snooping, such as man-in-the-middle attacks or packet sniffing. Along these lines, if it's possible to do so, we should also consider isolating the IoT devices to their own secure network that is separate from our other valuable enterprise assets. We've mentioned the importance of firewalls and IPS devices previously, and although we may not be able to specifically monitor some IoT devices, these should still be employed to inspect and limit traffic between any IoT devices and our internal network resources. This can prevent situations where an attacker gains access to an IoT device and attempts to pivot through the network, or to continue reconnaissance against other internal resources. There are physical security considerations as well. We pointed out the fact that because of the way these devices are often deployed, they could be vulnerable to things like theft or physical tampering. Obvious considerations would be the periodic physical inspection of a device for any signs of physical tampering, or maybe even securing the device in a tamper-resistant case. For example, with a smart thermostat maybe, we might want to lock that behind a clear, locked plastic case, which is made for such a device. Performing periodic asset inventory is also important here. There are many automated software solutions out there that will do this to save you a lot of time, and they'll map out your entire network to discover all of your endpoints and all of your assets. This can give you insight not only into all of the devices on your network, but also the communication channels they're using, which should be secured and monitored. We also want to have an awareness of the ports and services used by our IoT devices. These can be discovered in device documentation, and we should enable monitoring for any specific communication port outlined. We can also use scanning tools to discover this as well, things like maybe Wireshark or even Nmap. Some of the most commonly scanned ports by attackers include port 21 for FTP, port 22 for SSH, port 23 for Telnet, and alternatively port 2323, that's a well-known alternate port for Telnet, port 80 for HTTP, and port 8080 for HTTP proxy, and of course there are many more out there, but these are certainly ports that you would want to monitor. We should have an awareness of all the ports in our network through our network monitoring capabilities. And we would also want to identify any unusual ports that may seem to be passing traffic, especially from IoT devices. Unusual or unknown port traffic from IoT devices could be the first indicator of an attack or of an infected device that is attempting to spread malware or to pivot through our network. And last but not least, ensuring that we are patching and updating our IoT devices, including the firmware. We should have an understanding of whether or not these devices will automatically update, or if they require user intervention. Because many of these devices aren't in our faces all day long, so to speak, we may not receive timely alerts as we would maybe with a desktop or a mobile phone. Those are devices that we look at often, and we will receive alerts for updates. We may not get those types of notifications on our IoT devices, so we need to be aware of this. For that reason, you want to subscribe to things like vendor feeds or vendor emails to receive any update news regarding a particular device. Also, our periodic ongoing scanning procedures will help here as well. This will allow us to identify any new vulnerabilities found in our solutions that may need to be addressed.